is. Okay. Started. All right. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. Tonight's event is being recorded, so it's a reminder to please keep your microphone turned off. And there's going to be a panel discussion tonight, so type any questions that you have in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them after. I'm Lori Goldman with First Things First, Okanagan and Penticton, and we welcome all of you tonight to our Earth Week Deep Dive. We come to you today from the unceded and ancestral lands of the Seal Okanagan people who have cared for these lands for thousands of years. First Things First is a non-profit, non-partisan society, and we've been in Penticton area for about 7 years now. Our mission is to promote awareness of climate change and work to find solutions for a better future for our kids. Like right now, we're working really hard on not getting new homes connected to natural gas, stopping a new pipeline that is proposed from Penticton going up to Chute Lake at a time when we really need to stop all new projects and shift to renewables. Connecting with people like you to share projects and climate knowledge really helps all of us have hope in how we can work together to lobby our elected leaders for good policies on transportation and building emission reductions, creating sustainable communities, and also how we can inspire our neighbors and families to change habits, which is really hard to do that at home and in business. Earth Day 2022 is focused on accelerating solutions to combat our greatest threat, climate change, and to activate everyone, governments, citizens, and businesses to do their part. Everyone accounted for and everyone accountable. And I'm going to run a very short video. Hopefully it works. It's from the Earth Day website. Can everybody see it?
My name is Kathleen Rogers, and I am president of EarthDay.org. I'm here today to talk about the theme of Earth Day 2022, which is Invest in Our Planet. Our goal is to engage more than 1 billion people, governments, and institutions, along with businesses. And by using Earth Day as a platform, we aim to push aside the barriers that have been erected by the fossil fuel industry and economy and redirect all of our attention to creating a 21st century economy that brings back the healing and health of our planet, protects all of our species, including our own, and provides opportunities for everyone on the planet. People, governments, and businesses all fear change. But the status quo, the way we live today, is changing before our eyes. In building our future, individuals, businesses, entrepreneurs, inventors, and governments each have a unique role. We need to act individually and together.
So, kind of an inspiration for us to...
Hey everybody, Sydney here.
Oh,
Earth Day is April
my God.
22nd, the day on which we celebrate the beautiful planet we live on. Now,
Sorry about that, everyone. I knew there'd be some kind of a glitch.
That's great, Lori. I thought a puppet was going to come up out of the...
So there's so much we can all do. So I'm really looking forward to tonight. I'm going to introduce Odessa, and she's going to be taking over as our facilitator tonight. Odessa Cohen has recently joined the District of Summerland in November 2021 as the Sustainability Alternative Energy Coordinator after finishing her master's at SFU in Resource and Environmental Planning. Odessa also has a bachelor's in community planning and previously worked in rural Alberta as a land use planner. While still keeping her feet in the planning world, her greatest passion comes from education, awareness, and community development that supports environmental sustainability and advancing local government work in climate action. And we welcome Odessa to our South Okanagan community. And we're happy to partner on this Earth Week event tonight and Sunday. There's lots of events going on, and I'll put links to the Naramata and Summerland weekend events in the chat. And right now, I'll pass over to you, Odessa.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. So yes, thank you so much to everyone who's attending from near and far. It looks like we have a lot of diversity in the crowd today. So to get started, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have 4 of them here today. I'll start off with Dr. Alison Shaw. She is the current Executive Director of Action on Climate team out of SFU in Burnaby, but based in the Kelowna area. And she's also the founder of Flipside Consulting. She has over 2 decades of experience leading cross-cutting climate action and sustainability science and policy research, where in 2001, she contributed to the 3rd IPCC report summary for policymakers as the first authorized researcher studying science and policy interactions. Since that time, her work with ACT on low carbon resilience has gained her recognition as a resource for those seeking information on applying integrated and streamlined climate and sustainability solutions. So welcome, thank you, Dr. Shaw. And our next panelist is James Littley. James transitioned from a 14-year career in the BC Dragoons Army Reserve Regiment in 2012 and started working for the Okanagan Basin Water Board. James' education background includes degrees in local government and sustainability policy and human geography and political science. And he most recently has continued his education with a diploma in local government administration. Currently the operations and grant manager, his role has spanned over a number of projects with work in management of the milfoil invasive species program, project management of invasive zebra and quagga mussels, and continued project management and leadership roles that have formed partnerships across government and key stakeholders. And lastly, we have our 2 students here from Summerland Secondary School. We have Grace and Amelia. Both Grace and Amelia are grade 12 students at Summerland Secondary and will both be attending University of Victoria in the fall, so congratulations. Grace will be studying elementary education, while Amelia will be studying anthropology. Both have a passion and interest in environmental studies and climate change, and as youth in the community, are both interested in seeing what Summerland can do to be more environmentally friendly. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm going to get started. The panel today is going to go through individual questions for each of our panelists, and then depending on our time, I will also just do a group question that will bring a bit of the discussion and some of the themes brought out today with all 4 panelists. And we would just kindly ask that any questions are put in the chat box, and any microphones are only turned on at the end of our question period for audience Q&A, and I'll let you guys know in the audience when that can happen. So to get started, we'll start with Dr. Shaw. Your work has spanned across 20 years of climate change and sustainability science and policy research. Since that time in 2001, with your IPCC contribution, what major changes have you seen in how local governments and communities invest, both financially and politically, in dealing with the risks and vulnerabilities of climate change?
Well, that's a loaded question. In 20 years of watching the science and policy and studying the science and policy of climate change, there's been a lot of lessons learned. First and foremost, in 2001, during the 3rd assessment report, the international community was highly focused on national emissions reduction. And so a large part of the science at that time was focused on how do we reduce emissions as nations. And adaptation, risk and vulnerability, and the impacts of climate change were part of that. The IPCC does research on climate science, the impacts and risks of climate change, and the economics and the possible mitigation potential or emissions reduction potential of climate change. And so those three working groups have been developed since the 80s and framed the way that research gets done at the international scale, which is an important piece, actually, because while the international community 20 years ago was focusing on mitigation and opportunities to reduce emissions, we weren't talking very much about the impacts of climate change. And so what was going on at that time was that we wanted to get to root causes. The international community wanted national governments to just start avoiding emissions and reducing emissions. And there was this belief back then that it was going to be very easy, similar to the Montreal Protocol, which phased out CFCs really easily in '87. So there was this belief that when the international community comes together and sees a problem, they can actually overcome it. However, we all know 20, 30 years later that that's not the situation with climate change. There's far more dynamics involved in this situation, economically and politically. And so some of the lessons that I've learned, or that I've seen over the past 2 decades of really being involved, have seen this shift from focus on emissions reductions at the national level to emissions reductions at the city level, and at different scales of activity, not just cities, but different problematic sectors as well. So energy sectors, concrete sectors, these types of things. But there is this incredible emphasis as we move into the 6th assessment report that's just been released on kind of thinking about climate change less from a national perspective and more at mobilizing more of a local perspective on climate change. And the exciting piece of that is the recognition that cities will play a really significant role. Cities and communities, I use the term interchangeably, will play critical roles in actually mobilizing us toward more significant solutions. And the reason that is because climate change, as we've seen over the past year, especially in British Columbia, hits us at the community level, right? We've seen heat waves, we've seen droughts, we've seen wildfires, we've seen floods. We've seen it, all of these things that have been projected for the past 30 years from the amazing science that's being done at the international scale has actually come to fruition. And it's the local scale where we're impacted. And so the transition in the 6th assessment report has been away from just national governments and more looking at solutions across sectors and specifically with cities. So why that's important is because one of the things that's happened over the past 20 years of research is that emissions reduction and impacts and adaptation solutions have been siloed. And the reason is because of this artificial siloing in the international community to essentially study the research of climate impacts and adaptation responses and emissions reduction responses. And it makes sense when you're a researcher. It may even make sense at a national scale, but once you get down to a local scale, you cannot really consider these things in isolation from each other. So one of the things that I've been working a lot on over the past 5-6 years, and Odessa helped with, is building more integrated climate action at the community scale. So that involves both awareness building, and inclusion of different sectors. But it also means working within the guts of cities to cross different departments and make sure that people understand what the impacts of climate change are in their areas of work and what some of the solutions are, but also what the low carbon opportunities are to adapt to projected impacts. So this is a really important part of the messaging that's coming out of the sixth assessment report. Is it's not just this international problem that's going to get solved anymore. It's requiring everyone in between, and we've got to hit the ground running fast now that we're actually visibly experiencing the impacts of climate change. And so I don't know if any of you are familiar with the emissions reduction plan that just came out from the federal government. But it's kind of interesting because, again, it's a demonstration of how we're still thinking about emissions reduction as distinct and separate from climate impacts and our ability to respond to climate change. But there are so many opportunities to think about how to interweave climate action at the community scale, which involves, smart renewables and electrification that Summerland's really involved in, nature smart solutions, so nature-based solutions, protecting natural areas and so forth to help build our ecosystem services within our communities and encourage density, which encourages energy efficiency and actually mobilizes transportation opportunities. And also really relevant for the Okanagan area, the opportunity to build in sectors such as agriculture, which is actually a significant sector within the climate action realm as well, in terms of contributing different greenhouse gas emissions, with lots of opportunities and solutions in that sector. So bringing emissions reduction and adaptation solutions to the community scale is something that I'm very passionate about these days. And if I could leave you with one thing about the science and where it's at, it's essentially that we need to be doing these things in our communities. We need to be thinking about how to reduce our climate risk, how to reduce our emissions at the same time, but also, climate change is not an environmental problem. This is what we're starting to understand. It's actually a social design problem. It's a human problem. And so one of the things that is also very clear in the climate science is we cannot do climate action without addressing some of the problematic areas of human development and disparity, for instance. And so it's really critical that we start thinking about how we protect our vulnerable populations under projected climate risks, how we protect our ecosystems, and how we firm up our capital investments for infrastructure into the future that's actually resilient over time under climate impacts and actually advances our goals toward net zero carbon. So I'll just stop it there in case there's any questions.
That was really great. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive. And it started getting into the next section of questions too, which is great because yes, social equity, human and vulnerable populations is a big one that's coming out recently. So it's a very important topic to include and weave into our climate action and among the local mobilization of climate action and adaptation too. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go to James. I have your questions here, or your question. So the Okanagan Basin Water Board was established in 1970 and has provided resources to local governments and regions. The board and the resources it provides is an investment in our water resources here in the Okanagan. how do you think the landscape would look without 50 years of time, money, and political investment into a board of this nature?
Thank you, Odessa, for that question. And I've just been reflecting a little bit because this is a discussion focused on climate change, and I'm immersed in water, if you'll excuse the pun. And it's not always easy to make the link, right? But we can easily see the effects that climate change is having on water, but it's also kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that when climate change disrupts the hydrologic cycle, it's also propagating further effects of climate change. And so if you think about desertification, increasing floods, increasing droughts, things like that, the fact that a lot of greenhouse gas is actually water vapor, and you're going to have these atmospheric rivers, and then you lose surface water and ice that, you know, have the high albedo. I think it's high albedo, it might be low albedo, but anyway, the reflectivity. Water is a very important part of climate change in both aspects. So I'll just start with that, but getting to the question, if you think about what has happened in the last 50 years and what the valley would look like without kind of the intervention of the water board, you really have to look back at the 1960s and realize that there was poorly treated sewage going into the lakes from all of the communities around the lake. This led to huge amounts of primarily nitrogen and phosphorus in the lakes, leading to big algae blooms everywhere, water that people didn't want to swim in, water that you didn't want to boat in, and then exacerbated by the introduction of invasive Eurasian water milfoil, which had spread to all the valley lakes by 1974 and really forms these thick mats over the surface of the water, which further increases algae by robbing oxygen as it deteriorates. So our lakes were just a big mess, and no one wanted to come here. And actually, in a meeting a couple of days ago, someone made a comment that you practically couldn't give away lakeshore property in Okanagan in the 1960s and early 1970s. Property values were going down, and that's a big difference from what it is now. And so with all those things in mind, some of the things, the OBWB was specifically set up to address these issues at a valley-wide scale. And so in the intervening 50 years, we've spent over $65 million to invest in sewage infrastructure so that there's no more raw sewage going into the lakes. It's all treated to a standard where you could pretty much drink it coming out of the wastewater treatment plants at this point. I know lots of people find that offensive to think about, but you pretty much could. It's that good of a standard. Algae blooms are more and more rare and exist in fewer and fewer areas. The OBWB spends now about $600,000 a year to control the milfoil problem. And it's not just an aesthetic and a tourism problem. I could spend an hour talking about the ecological effects of milfoil as well. So those are some of the things that we've done. And it's really important that initially the thought of the Okanagan Basin Water Board was as a regional authority to manage kind of all water related issues, but the political will didn't exist at the time it was established to give it that mandate. And so from 1970 till about 2003, all we did is provide sewage infrastructure grants and do the milfoil control program. But in 2003, there was a severe drought. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Okanagan Mountain Park fire. And that was a catalyst to re-examine the role that the OBWB had been imagined for. And this is when local businesses and community leaders convinced the regional districts to go back to the original concept of the OBWB. And this included establishing the Water Stewardship Council, which is a volunteer organization of experts, including academics, local, provincial, and federal governments, First Nations, agriculture, forestry, engineers, geoscientists, water providers, who all sit around the table even to this day every month and provide expertise and guidance to the water board. And I have to say, because our other panelists are high school students going into university, I came out of my first degree at university in 2012. And one of my first experiences with the water board was to go into a Water Stewardship Council meeting. And the first thing we did is go around the table and hear the introductions of 35 or 40 volunteers. And I come out of university with a really pessimistic outlook on the world. And yet I sat down at this one meeting and realized how many good people with so much knowledge are trying to work on this type of problem. So I'll wrap it up by saying, what would it look like without us? Well, I think it could be a very different picture. It could have a lot of water pollution, more floods and droughts, more species endangered or extirpated, less economic activity from tourism and agriculture. But it's important to note that this was catalyzed by really political will of local governments and local communities and the elected officials who established the board as a partnership. And then the kind of rhetorical question I'd like to leave the audience with before the next part of the discussion is just to ponder whether maybe we've come too far. Like, have we made this valley now too attractive? And, you know, we've got increased population, increased development, increased demand on water, increased recreation, increased agriculture. And I'm not saying NIMBY, I'm not saying we exclude anyone or anything like that, but we're at maybe a turning point where we need to reconsider how we are managing development, allowing boats on our lakes and in what numbers, allowing, you know, tourism and things like that, what activities are you know, permissible and those sorts of things. So I'll leave it for you to ponder. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. Yeah, it's amazing how much the water board has done over the years, and it does, you almost take it for granted. You don't quite see everything. It's almost superficial, you know, on the surface of the water there until you start, you know, going a little deeper and realizing all those impacts and the cumulative impacts that water has across the landscape and for the people. I mean, we know that we rely and depend on water, but to the full extent of it is not always realized. And I like that there's been some connections where between you and Allison in your comments and your responses that it's local government, it's those connections and that local regional action that needs to happen because we all realize that our regional issues are ours and they're unique and they need that unique response to it as well. So I'm going to go on to the next set of questions, and this is for Amelia and Grace. I'll let you guys take turns because it's directed just at the two of you here. So as two grade 12 students who have plans to go into post-secondary studies in the fall, how do you see the role of teachers and students for addressing climate solutions, either at your high school level currently, or even at the further education at the university level?
All right, I can start with that. Thank you for the question. It's great. I just want to right off the bat just say that we shouldn't be afraid of talking about climate change at school, right? And I think that is something that everybody's pretty much aware of now. It's just the thought of it is just now that we have to act on that and you know, implement the climate change you know, solutions into our lives, right? And I think that the teachers and students always do a great job at educating other people and connecting with each other and just, you know, having that community of people who really want to make a difference in our world, right? And as someone who's passionate about the environment and somebody who is interested in that stuff, it would be a lot more beneficial to, I think, as youth in the community if we actually started acting on it a little bit more. And we see that with like the eco village that's happening at Cartwright or in that area, right? So that's obviously a really great you know, start to this stuff. But I think something really important as well is yeah, again, just finding more ways to just talk about it as a class and to not be afraid of that topic, right? I mean, our school does lots of like recycling and just we would try to reduce food waste, but you know, how can we start to educate other people on how to not be a part of that consumerism and just trends like that, right? Because that isn't good for our environment at all. And you know, I think as youth we should recognize that and then be able to act on it, because that's a huge part of, you know, the climate crisis, and how we're part of it is also just acting on it, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say for right now. Amelia, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you, Odessa, again for inviting. Thank you very much for the question, and it's nice to see everyone. So basically, I think that education and teachers have a huge role in discussing climate change to us, the students, and I think it's important because they are huge role models, and they show us kind of they create opportunities for us. And like Mrs. Becker introduced me to Odessa, and she brought us into our classroom, and we talked about Summerland solar farm. And so I did a whole presentation, and I researched, and I did a lot of kind of engagement with the District of Summerland's kind of go with that project. And so I feel really inspired by not only my teacher to be more involved in things like this with my peers, Grace, and I feel like it's really important to discuss and be a part of this kind of community, and into my future as a future university student, to go into these kind of clubs and be involved and learn more about what we can do about our future and hopefully for future generations. And so I hope to, as well, into my future career as a museum curator, hopefully inspire young individuals and incorporate that into my beliefs and career as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. To kind of expand a little bit more on that, outside of school, do you guys find that your friends or even peers are more open to talking about climate change and climate action, what that is, how they're experiencing it even on their end as an individual level and maybe even as a group level? Have you guys noticed that within your age group or other classrooms?
Yeah, I definitely have noticed I think that especially at least our grade and the people who are involved or who are integrated and stuff, they are definitely educated on, what climate change looks like and how we can take action upon that. I think one thing that this goes for, I think, all students in high school is that, again, we kind of we put our personal interests first before the environment, and that can be like, buying, fast fashion items and just, becoming in consumerism, right? So I think that people are interested and engaged. I think it's hard for some people to carry that motivation as they move on to post-secondary and be more invested in, the environment and how we can take care of it, because a lot of what consumes us as teenagers is just media and influences and habits and like bad habits and things we consume and whatnot, right? So a lot of that is directed towards us, and I think it's important to be aware that that's not just, that's only a sliver of our life as a teenager. Like there's also our environment's a humongous part of our future, right? So I think that there's lots of people in the school who are invested in that. I don't think there's enough though. I think that we could do a better job as teachers, or as myself as a future teacher, to try to engage more people in that discussion, because I just think sometimes there's a lacking of motivation, because people often, I think, get also climate anxiety, which is people get so worked up over just the environment and how it's just not doing well, and we keep consuming stuff, right? So I think that can cause a bit of problems a little bit, and I think it's important to push through the climate anxiety and actually start to make some sustainable choices and teach others on that. Yeah, and Amelia, do you have anything else to say about that?
Yeah, and I think there needs to definitely be a change in attitude. I think that the motivation and the will to change and the belief is there, but I think they just need to their actions need to align with their beliefs. So I think that you can say a lot and you can agree with a lot, but you actually need to follow through and engage with your community. And I think a lot of people can feel overwhelmed and they feel like change is difficult and it can be hard. But I think it's necessary and inevitable for a sustainable future. And I think people should realize that little climate conscious decisions over time can make a huge impact. So shopping local, carpooling. I know that a lot of my friends or my classmates drive to school, but in reality, you know, they're not too far away from school and they could carpool and ride a bike or walk. And, you know, it's nice to stay fit as well, but it's good for climate. Um, so yeah, I think that people's, in the end, it's their beliefs need to start aligning. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate those responses. And yeah, it just kind of helps me reflect a bit too on my youth and when I was in high school and what was happening then. And yeah, it's changed a lot. And I'm very glad to hear that there are more conversations at your age group and your level of education that is happening, because it was always very different 15 years ago for myself. So we're going to go into the next round of questions. We're at almost 7:40 here, so we do want to make sure we allow a little bit of time for audience questions. So for the next about 10 minutes, we're just going to do a bit of a more of a rapid fire question for each of our panelists. So we briefly had some of our panelists talk about some of the social implications, being social equity, human well-being, and vulnerable populations, and the impacts that climate change has on those groups. So a single question that I'm going to be presenting to Dr. Shaw and James is, how is your work or how is your work invested in understanding the social impacts from climate change and on vulnerable groups of people dealing with human well-being and social equity? So let's start with James this time. And I'll give you a few minutes to respond.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to do something that you're not really supposed to do as a public speaker and acknowledge our shortcomings in this aspect. I think that there's more work to be done for us as an organization about really looking at you know, the effect that we're having on social equity and vulnerable populations particularly. But in reflecting on the question, I just note that climate change will also be a driver for changing who is considered a vulnerable population. And especially when we think about age groups as vulnerable populations and look at the heat wave and the effects it had on seniors last year. I saw an article in Castanet yesterday that said Kelowna is predicted to have the highest longest lasting heat waves of any Canadian urban area by 2050. And I was thinking about my kids and, you know, my future grandkids presumably, and how they'll have to deal with that. And then I realized I'll be 70 years old by 2051, and I'll be in the vulnerable population myself. But also when we look at floods and fires and droughts, you have people who've been landowners for a long time and haven't really been vulnerable, who all of a sudden cannot get home insurance and are losing their homes. And so we've invested in things like science and technology, hydrometric stations to understand the flow of water. We've recently done some high-tech LiDAR studies, which create really detailed elevation models of the ground to understand where water is going to flow and help with flood protection, as well as looking at the Okanagan Lake Regulation System. We've worked with the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and they've established environmental flow needs, which tell you how much water needs to be in a certain stream at a given point in time for a certain species. And so you can stop starving the fish of water and stop starving the trees of water and things like that. But we haven't done any of that with a view to vulnerable populations or a view to social equity, even though our mandate is to protect and enhance the quality of life in the Okanagan, which is a very ecocentric approach, or sorry, anthropocentric approach. So maybe I'll leave it there so as not to take more time.
No worries. Thank you so much. And yeah, the way I see it is by identifying the gaps, you open up opportunities for that growth and change. And I hope that the Okanagan Water Board is able to advance on those gaps there. So thank you so much. And we'll put that same question to you, Dr. Shaw.
Yeah, no, it's a fundamental aspect of climate action is thinking about equitable climate action. So there's a lot of talk about, you know, EVs are going to save the world. Well, that's not exactly an equitable climate action. It's a climate action, and it's welcome. However, as I mentioned before, the way that we're going to contribute to deep climate action is by responding to the needs of the vulnerable. So it's both the existing vulnerable. So when we talk about vulnerability and climate change, we talk about the existing vulnerable populations, which relate to seniors, as James mentioned, just the horrible mortality rate in the heat wave last year showcases that children are part of the vulnerable populations, and typically marginalized people that don't have access to power are part of that vulnerable population as the voiceless population. And First Nations groups are considered very vulnerable, especially in the northern regions of our country, which are experiencing climate impacts at a far greater rate than we are in the southern areas. And so we need to understand the kind of vulnerabilities that already exist, because we know that once the heat waves come and once the floods come and once these situations start to become more frequent, it's going to exacerbate the problems for people that are already struggling. And so that's looking for the existing vulnerabilities in our systems so that we can build that adaptive capacity. We can help consider actions that actually build the resilience of these communities. And that's what we talk about a lot in climate change. And then, as James alluded to, there's the future of vulnerable populations. So vulnerability is going to change over time as we start experiencing projected climate risk. And some of those vulnerabilities include being susceptible to flood risk, for instance, or being susceptible to urban wildfire interface risks. These types of risks are going to start emerging as well. So we need to be thinking about floodplain mapping, how to either prevent and avoid development in floodplains or adapt the development within floodplains to respond to projected conditions over time. So these are things that we need to think about seriously. And in ACT's work, what we do is we say you can't think about the vulnerable populations and impacts and risks without also thinking of and adaptation strategies to those risks and vulnerabilities, without also thinking about how to adapt and respond in ways that are low carbon. So for instance, the past year with the heat wave, we saw some politicians and some people stand up and say, let's put an air conditioner in every senior's apartment or home. Well, of course, you know, that makes sense in terms of minimizing vulnerability, but it contributes to emissions. So if we did that en masse at scale, that would be exacerbating the climate problem. We really have to start encouraging thinking about this. And I promise you, and Odessa and others on the call can vouch for me, that there is not enough integrated thinking. And so what we do is we run the risk of just putting Band-Aid solutions on the problem that actually leads to increased vulnerability over time, whether it's increasing emissions over time from our adaptation solutions, or whether it's not considering risk and vulnerability in things like where we put our EV infrastructure. So what if we're putting, significant capital investments in floodplains that are going to get flooded more frequently? These types of things. So this integrated type of thinking is what we need, this systems thinking.
Thank you so much. To wrap up the last of the questions here for the students, Amelia and Grace, a similar question is posed, but what are these climate risks that you see in youth? And do you think that there are enough resources available to yourselves to address those risks? So if either one of you want to respond to those, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. The hard part about it though is that we don't really know lots of the risks that are involved when we think about climate change in youth. Obviously, we can like predict and we can view the data. We can say, oh yeah, okay, well we have an estimation here what might happen, but obviously, we don't know for sure, right? And I think as humans, it's hard for us to live in that unknown time period, right? And so, I mean, it's hard for me to say what it will look like for the youth later, but I can't imagine that unless we actually start to take action. And obviously these things will progress and they'll get worse and whatever. We don't want that for my future or anybody else's future, right? So yeah, I think that yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Yeah, Emily, do you have anything to add to that? I just gotta reflect a little bit more on this, hey?
Yeah, so as Grace mentioned, it's basically we'll see in our future, but I think it's just important to just discuss as a team and just have those opportunities to discuss like this panel and just be a part of your community and engage. And I think that will help because through research and trying to understand what's happening to our planet and teenagers on their phone, social media, on the news, even documentaries, I think it can become overwhelming, and especially for students because you feel so powerless. And it's important to address the anxieties about your climate and climate change and the increased stress levels due to that, and understand that those feelings are valid. But for those who are passionate about these kind of things like myself, just use that as a source of reasoning to be involved and continue in search for, instead of fearing and ignoring the climate crisis that impacts our everyday lives, have a brighter future by discussing as a team and being involved.
No, thank you so much, guys. It was somewhat purposely a bit of a hard question to answer. I personally, from my end, I haven't seen a lot of work related to youth impacts or even younger population impacts from climate change. These are one of those gaps in our social equity climate research areas and just general knowledge. So that in itself is something of, just to use the word, of an investment that needs to happen, that there is broader impacts that we need to be aware of and the resources that are most likely not there to address it. So thank you so much, Amelia and Grace, for your responses. And thank you so much, James and Allison, for all your responses as well. We have 10 minutes or so. One of our panelists and hopefully a couple others are able to stick around a little after 8 if the conversation goes a little bit further. It's always great to have those engaging conversations. So if there's any questions, we can address any that are in the chat that haven't been discussed already. But if you would like to speak, you are more than welcome to turn your microphone on and ask a question to all or one specific panelist. We've got about 10 minutes here, so I'll leave the floor open to our guests and our viewers.
I think Glenn's hand was up and Bill's hand is next, yeah.
Hi there. This is for anybody. I'm here by mistake. I thought it was about investing as in private investing. But connected with that, I'm wondering if anybody in the panel has an idea as to how things are likely to go with adaptation, in the sense that if we do start doing all sorts of adaptation now, are we going to be doing it in a very short timeline? And this is connected with Alison's comments about adaptation. And I'm afraid now, for example, down by the seashore, are we going to do the wrong thing if sea level rise especially speeds up? Now, if we wait, is that going to produce more realization that we have to be thorough and think in longer terms than if we do it now? Or is it going to create more panic and immediate and thoughtless adaptation? And connected with all of that is it's my fear that if we do not continue to concentrate on mitigation, that a lot of the adaptation may prove inappropriate and less effective in the long run. And I'm wondering what responses might be from anybody else on that. Thank you.
No, those are great questions and concerns, Glenn, and it comes back to the different scales of action. So when we're talking about emissions reduction at the international scale, what we're trying to do is minimize the level of impact over time, the level of climate change, and thus climate impact over time. Whereas adaptation has typically been brushed aside as something way long-term out there, but we're starting to see after 30 years of scientists telling us that actually it's closer than we thought. So it is one of these situations where we have to be very strategic about how we move. So instead of, for instance, building higher dikes and seawalls along the coast now to prepare and respond to sea level rise into the future, there's lots of other opportunities. One that would be less emissions intensive. So you get at that problem of building harder infrastructure actually is an emissions intensive response to adaptation. A lot of work that I've been focusing on these days is about how to use nature-based solutions for adaptation as our primary way of addressing some adaptation like sea level rise or flood risk in terms of creating more permeable surfaces in our communities, all of these types of approaches. So there's a lot of thought going into these realms. But yes, we still need that international effort to reduce our emissions so that those impacts are obviously not increasing over time. In terms of adaptation solutions and the cost and time scale, that's just another challenge. And in the work that we do at ACT, what we pretty much are saying to cities in different sectors is Start including it now in your procurement, in your policy making. Start looking at what your climate risks are, and every project that you do or every consulting firm that you hire has to showcase the ways that their project or their idea reduces vulnerability, reduces climate risks, both now and into the future, and reduces emissions. And so this is the work that we do at ACT, which is essentially saying, if we send the business signal to the market, then we have lots of creativity in our entrepreneurial systems that can adapt. If we stop subsidizing oil and gas tomorrow and take those subsidies and apply it to thinking about climate action solutions, we could have a really creative time. There'd be like entrepreneurs all over this. So it's just, how do you send those business signals? And we're getting closer and closer. We're getting closer and closer with different corporations, different banks starting to require these types of criteria, how to reduce climate risk and how to reduce emissions. And so I think doing that over time will only strengthen more integrated systemic solutions. To your point, Glenn. So I don't think we need to just throw money at adaptation right now. We need to think strategically about the vulnerabilities and make sure everyone's on board thinking those through.
I'd like to just pick up on this as well, following up on Glenn's question on what Alison had to say. I also sit on the board of directors for Environment Funders Canada, and that's a group of philanthropic organizations, community foundations, family foundations, banks foundations, government agencies, and more than ever before, there's funding going into the environment. A lot of the foundations are switching to equity-based funding and trust-based philanthropy, where they are focusing on equity-seeking groups, a lot of focus on reconciliation. And then within the broader environmental funding community, there are also collaboratives like Climate Impacts Collaborative, who are focusing real money, power, and attention on changing things and getting not only projects on the ground happening, but also engaging government and making changes through these structures of power. And there's also a broad conversation about re-examining and changing those structures of power. So I'm ever an optimist, and I'd say that there is a lot of action happening, and it's a good bet to place your investments in the environment right now. And I also think that there's a bit of a false dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation, because I think a lot of the things that we can do to mitigate are also the things we're going to need to do to adapt in the long run. So Alison mentioned permeable. How about permeable streets and parking lots that are also landscaped and covered in trees? Plant more variation of trees and decrease forest monoculture. Require green building and heat pumps instead of natural gas furnaces. Water saving and reuse technology, drip irrigation for agriculture, and better drought tolerant residential landscape aesthetics. Slow it, spread it, sink it, stormwater policies. Urban forest interface management, fire smart practices and building codes. And Don Gayton's on the phone, on the call. Shout out for saving and restoring wetlands, which and the reason I'd say that's adaptation as well as mitigation. I own a motorbike, and I notice when I drive, I live on a street that's mostly agriculture, but when I come onto the street, there's a walled community. And as I drive through the walled community, I can feel the heat radiating off the walls and the pavement. And as soon as I go around the traffic circle and I'm instead surrounded by orchards, there's like a 10 or 15 degree drop, difference that hits me. And so, all of these ecosystem services are going to be part of, or should be part of, our adaptation strategy, but also work to mitigate the effects of what's causing climate change.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. It is 8 o'clock, but we do have a couple more questions left to go. I have one here from Bill for James. When will only electric boats be allowed on our lakes? that would clean up the small spills of gas and stop the burning of fossil fuels and boating on our lakes. So do you know, James, at all within your capacity at the water board, if there's any work in that sector?
That's a very specific question, Bill, and I won't give a very specific answer on that aspect, but what I will say is that there are several conversations happening right now that have been very recent and have just started about how to manage boats on our lake better, because there have been a number of studies that, not only into fuel spills, but also starting to understand the effect that wake boats have on the substrate of our lakes. And Heather Larrett out of West Kelowna has done some amazing work with these aerial photos that show the plumes coming from 40 or 50 feet down after a wake boat has gone by. And so there's discussion about, how many boats our lakes can actually handle, whether we should, even if we're going to allow wake boats, whether they should be allowed to have certain speed limits near shore. I think there are a lot of strategies we can do to better manage our lakes and maybe get to that point where we have electric boats or boats that otherwise don't pollute, like the ones that we currently use.
Thanks for that. I have a question for the students. I see your hand. I'll get to you in a minute there, just to make sure we get all of our questions in the chat box here answered. So for Amelia and Grace, there was a question asking about the use of friendly competition between classes or different grades at school, whether that's been done or not for environmental awareness or climate awareness activities. Do you guys see that as a way to further engage the students, as an effective way to maybe put it in a fun way for them that's both a learning but also fun game, kind of fun competitive way to engage through climate?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I really like that. Not from my 4 years of high school, we haven't done a competition like that, but that does sound like a great idea and it worked really well. Because again, like thrifting and like just that's a trend right now is that, and that's great because it's an eco-friendly way to shop and not like, fall into fast fashion, all that stuff, right? So that's a really great question. I totally think that could be an opportunity that our school presents to the students where we can start to become more informative and just spread the word about how we can change our own lives and how we can make them more eco-friendly, right? Because we're like the future and whatnot. So it's our job also to make sure we're on top of that, and to have a game and do that is a great idea. So that would absolutely work in our school for sure. Amelia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so like Grace said, I think that would be a great way to engage all the students. I think a fun way to incorporate climate change and education into that would be always great. And I think that's always just fun and games. Everyone loves that. So yeah, I think even when we just work as a team and just like I'm in an environmental science class with Grace Bond, and our teacher, Miss Becker, she sometimes lets us, we have a little, I don't know if you guys have seen, but there's a community kind of garden next to the high school in town. And we kind of had little cleanups of that, and those are nice team building exercises. So even like that, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing some things for the upcoming Earth Day event as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to engaging in that.
Awesome. Always glad to hear the competitive streak is still there and lively at school. It's always a good way to get people out there. I still use it at my work. We have a competition that I'm proposing for Earth Week. So adults will also be competitive. So no ages limited here. And is it Glenn or Glenn? How would you pronounce your name there?
Hi, it's Glenn.
Glenn, I'll let you go to your question there.
Thank you. Well, it's more of a comment. That is James's wonderful response in terms of when you can do mitigation and adaptation in concert. There's another thing that we can do if we're also concerned not only about mitigation, but about social justice and reconciliation at the same time. So, for example, a lot of the somewhat impoverished off-grid indigenous communities are still using diesel for their generation, their power generation. And so if we can speed up the conversion to whatever's suitable for the area, whether it's hopefully solar power, wind power, maybe run of the river, and so on, we can accomplish those three things with those of us who have the extra money or can convince our credit union, if it is very engaged in doing good work, such as Van City is. So yeah, that sort of expands on James's thing. And while we're talking about things in terms of contributing to adaptation, especially, but also to mitigation, I don't know what the situation is like in the interior, but here in the urban built-up coast, we can find that generally speaking, or even though there is a very prominent exception to this in credit unions tend not to invest in oil and gas, and they do tend to do some work in adaptation and also in social justice, possibly more for the size of the institution than do the large banks. But I don't have statistics on that, and I could be wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if there's
know.
any comments on that that can tell me I'm wrong about something or what.
Glenn, that's just fantastic, because the big banks are subsidizing fossil fuels. They're essentially part of the problem. Credit unions really try not to be. And Van City is something that I've been interested in as just a best practice example of funders. So using local investment for local projects. And I think we need to start talking to our credit unions in the valley in the Okanagan Valley about such things. It's a really powerful tool to ensure that your investment funds are contributing to local action. And I think that's a really important way to leave the conversation. Everyone run off and get out of CIBC and Royal Bank and get into your credit unions.
Well, thank you so much. We're about 10 after 8 here. So out of respect for everyone's time and their evenings, it is Thursday night, which is basically Friday for most of us. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists who came out. Thank you so much to all of the guests who arrived as well, your time and patience and insight. I'll let Lori finish off as well with first things first.
That's great. Thank you so much to everyone. As a wrap up, I'm just going to let you know that we will be sending out a recording of this session probably tomorrow or Saturday as it gets prepared. And please share it with friends and family, and go to our website, firstThingsFirst.com, to see videos, read articles, and join our mailing list or become a member, because your membership in our society helps us to do more and to raise the bar with with all of our local elected officials. There are lots of things happening this weekend. Tomorrow in Summerland, and Saturday and Sunday, we're having an electric vehicle parade going up to Summerland, and a fair, which will be exciting. Naramata is having some activities. I put the link in the chat. By the way, you know that you can save the chat by clicking the three dots at the bottom of the chat, and it will save a copy of it to your computer. For people who are not familiar with Zoom tricks, but we will be sending out all of this other information. Another thing is that David Cassian is going to be presenting the city's new corporate climate action plan, and Jeremy Dressner of the RDOS is going to be talking about climate actions at our next deep dive in May. So if you sign on to be a subscriber, we send out the newsletter, e-newsletter, only once a month, and you'll get the update from that and the way to participate. And I don't know if there's anything else, except bank switch is really important. If you take your funds out of your regular bank, let them know why you're doing it, because that is having a big impact. And the same thing with if you have an RRSP or a TFSA, you can find out where your funds are, and you can ask your investment advisor to make a switch to ethical funds. It makes a huge, huge difference. Yes, Pauline said pension funds as well. Absolutely. We can have an impact, and joining a society like us or the groups that that James was talking about, we need to work together, and we need to raise the bar. We have to raise the bar to get our elected leaders to listen, because they don't want to spend money on our future, and they need to, or we won't have a future. I want to thank you, Odessa. It was really great having you here tonight. And thank you to Dr. Shaw and James. It was a really great evening. And to our two youth, it's really great to see you guys. And we have a youth group in us in First Things First, and we're always looking for people to partner up with and help you to get organized. So, you know, Amelia and Grace, if you have anything that you need us to help you with, we're here. Thanks a ton. Have a good evening.
Night,
Take care,
everyone.
guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.